How are the credit markets behaving? How are market participants dealing with liquidity? For answers to all this and much more, stay tuned to the Expert Lounge, a podcast brought to you by India Ratings and Research Private Limited. Because ultimately, for opinions on risk and credit, India comes to us. Hi, I'm Siddharth Rego, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to each and every one of our listeners, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. And welcome to the Expert Lounge. Today's topic for discussion is the credit market. And who better to take us through this topic than Soumyajit Niyogi? Soumyajit, welcome to the podcast and thanks for taking the time for this.
Thank you very much, Siddharth.
Great. So, for all of those who don't know Soumyajit, Soumyajit is a director at India Ratings and Research, and he looks into the core analytical group and all things credit market sector related. So, Soumyajit, let's just dive right into today's topics. There's been a lot of chatter happening within the credit space of late. But you research on this topic and you also authoring a monthly periodical on this. Based on your research, what are your key findings within the credit market, and how are you see things going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Siddharth. So one of the interesting thing is that it's not the rise in the interest rate. It was well anticipated, and as anticipated by across the participants, the interest rates have started moving up, and more visible in the shorter end of the curve. The longer end of the curve is showing the resilience because in anticipation of rate hike, it has already went up substantially.
Right.
Whereas the shorter end of the curve with losing liquidity in the market till you can say April, the shorter end of the curve was almost close to pre-pandemic level.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, and this has now it has already crossed the pre-pandemic level, and to certain extent, it is comparable to 2018 and 2019 level. So, in a situation that within 2 months, we are seeing the shorter end of the curve has gone up by almost 100 to 120 basis point. In some segment, it is
Wow.
also 150 basis point.
Wow.
That is one of the I shouldn't say is a challenge, but yeah, it is the notable thing. And why we are saying it is notable, the thing is that particularly we are in a situation that most of the corporate would look for the working capital financing because of the
Right. Right.
input costs are at the elevated level, and the corporate which had already utilized the raw material which were factored the Q4 cost, now they will look for the new cost which is at the very high level. So
Right.
for working capital finance requirement, they will look for the short-term financing requirement, and for NBFC also, it
Okay.
is not that they will always borrow the longer end of the curve, which is good, but definitely the CP market is always bread and butter for them, and they really can't they can stay away from this thing. So for both of them, this is the situation when the short-term rates are up, they will have to pay more.
Right, so actually that was really interesting, and thanks for putting the macro context into perspective for us. And you spoke about working capital financing and the fact that prices are just shooting up, inflation is high. So how do you see liquidity going forward? Do you think there's a scope for further tightening of liquidity, and how do players kind of
Right,
adjust to this
right, right.
constantly changing scenario?
That's actually one of the key things we should highlight. And in last couple of months, a number of times we have been highlighting that last 2 years when we had exceptionally high system liquidity. I mean, system liquidity means liquidity in the banking system. And some point it was as high as 7 to 8 trillion. So which was
Did you come again?
7 to 8 trillion. It was
Wow.
5 to 6% of NDTL.
Right.
Compared to that situation, even if I talk about in the month of April, the daily surplus, including the daily operation and also whatever the outstanding operation, used to clock averagely about the 5 lakh crores or 5
Right.
trillions, which
Right.
was again it's 3% of the 3 to 4% of the NDTF, which has come down sharply. Even just few days back, it touched 2 lakh crore. So from 5 trillion surplus in a day to 2 trillion surplus, it is a sharp fall in the system liquidity.
Huge shift.
Huge shift. It's a huge shift. Having said that, yes, from the durable liquidity perspective, it is 5 trillion, but the difference between the durable liquidity and the daily liquidity available in the banking system, surplus liquidity,
Right.
it is basically largely surplus by the central as well as state government. We should focus only on on the liquidity surplus available in the banking system, which is now 2 trillion. Now, the interesting question, I'm
Yeah.
sure you are going to ask me that how did it happen? It
You
happened.
can read my mind, so.
Yo, yes, yes. This is obvious question, and the reason is two. One is, of course, the balance of payment. For last couple of months, we are seeing the current account deficit. It is not the first step. It has always been always been deficit, but because of the oil price and further import, the current account deficit went up along with the capital account outflow. So the couple
Wow.
with the current account deficit and the capital account outflow from capital account, the overall
Yeah.
BOP in the Q4 has turned negative. And
Interesting.
and India is expecting that after last 3 years of current by BOP surplus, the
Right.
FY23 possibly will land up at the total BOP deficit of 30 billion, which is close
Wow.
to 0.9% of the GDP.
That's staggering, huh?
That's right, Agani. And this is not the end of the story. Along with the BOP deficit, the overall the currency circulation is also increasing. So it's a twin problem. It's impacting the banking system liquidity, rising balance of payment deficit, along with the rising cash in circulation is actually draining out the entire system liquidity from the banking
Yeah.
system.
And it's but natural that something like this would have a cascading impact and a lot of consequences as a whole, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So the thing is that we are in a situation like interest rate is going up. We have balance of payment deficit, and likely in the coming 4 quarters we could have balance of payment deficit in all the quarters. And inflation is already high. There is no doubt about it. And overall business environment because of the war and also the geopolitical volatile tension, the business environment is also not very
Right.
conducive, and the capital market across the globe including us is volatile. So in a situation the macroeconomic condition is bit volatile, I shouldn't say challenging, rupee is under pressure. There could be some challenge for the ensuring for ensuring financing, not for the entities having a very high I mean high credit worthiness,
Right.
but marginal entity they could face some of the entity could face challenge in accessing finance. They have to pay high. And
Okay.
yes, this is one thing we should be cognizant about this thing. And entity having a good balance sheet liquidity or with good access to the market
Yeah.
should be preferred.
Right. And I think we've seen that happen over the last year and a half. The large players have built up a lot of balance sheet liquidity, and that just helps to shore up reserves. Whereas the smaller players might find it a little bit challenging during this time, coming few months. But moving on from here, let's talk about the money market segment. When you talk about the credit market, everyone wants to know what's happening within this space. So how do you see things happening within the money market segment? How are things going to shape up here?
So one of the things is that the with the rising working capital requirement, the CP issuances has remained being firm for the corporate. It is stable, and NBFC they are also tapping the money market, particularly the CP issuances. On the other hand, the CD issuances, which were absolutely muted in FY21 and also large part of FY22, that has gained enough traction because of the precipitous fall in the banking system liquidity, along with
Right.
a good traction in the banking system credit, which is showing good disbursement. So
Right.
couple with overall in anticipation, the banks is expecting rate to go up. The CD issuances have gone up substantially.
Right. Interesting, Soumyajit. So if I had to just sum up what you said, the key takeaways, one would be, that the overall financing requirement will continue be strong and show some amount of growth. And there would be a fair bit of working capital finance being raised and certain amount of refinancing. And at the same time, a strong balance sheet liquidities for corporates. So NBFCs would definitely be a factor to be monitored, going forward.
Right.
Right. Yeah, very interesting, Soumyajit. Thanks so much for your time and for sharing your key insights and for being an expert at our lounge. So, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here, and thank you to our listeners listening to the Expert Lounge. Thanks for being here. If you want a deeper insight into what Soumyajit said, you can check out the detailed report. We'll be sharing the link along with this podcast, so do have a look at it. In the meanwhile, we'll see you at the next podcast of Expert Lounge, brought to you by India Ratings, because ultimately, for opinions on risk and credit, India comes to us.